a clone training platform above the planet Ringo Vinda, a trooper named Tup raised his rifle and shot Jedi General Tiplar through the chest. No warning, no hesitation. 1 second he was following her orders in the middle of a firefight, the next she was dead on the ground, and he had no memory of pulling the trigger. This happened during the Clone Wars, not at the end, years before Order 66 was ever supposed to activate. The Jedi Order investigated. They found a malfunctioning biochip inside Tup's brain, the exact same chip carried by every clone trooper in the Grand Army of the Republic. They called it a defect, a 1 in a million glitch. They closed the file and moved on. It wasn't a glitch, it was a rehearsal. What the Jedi dismissed as one broken chip was the first live proof, playing out in front of their own eyes, that a kill switch had been sitting inside every soldier they commanded the entire time. And the man who could have warned them about all of this years earlier had already tried. They didn't listen to him either. By the time Tup pulled that trigger, the Jedi had already buried 3 separate warnings that should have stopped this before it started. How the Jedi Order built and then died by its own warning system starts with a hidden vault most fans have never heard of, a Padawan who found it a generation earlier, and an oracle the Council decided wasn't worth believing. Long before Dooku ever raised a lightsaber against the Republic he'd sworn to protect, he was a young Padawan wandering the lower levels of the Jedi Temple with his friend, Sifo Dyas. According to the canon novel Jedi Lost, the two of them stumbled onto something the Jedi Council never wanted to find. It was called the Bogan Collection, a hidden vault of Sith relics and dark side artifacts, quietly assembled and curated by a Jedi Master named Lene Costana. Costana wasn't some rogue outsider. She was a respected member of the Order, and she believed, with real conviction, that the Sith would return one day. The Council knew about her collection. They let her keep it. What they didn't do was let her act on it. The vault sat there, catalogued and secret, a monument to a warning nobody upstairs wanted to hear. This matters because it demolishes one of the most repeated lines in Star Wars lore, that the Jedi were blindsided by the Sith's return, caught completely off guard after 1,000 years of peace. They weren't blindsided. They had a classified archive built specifically to study the threat, staffed by one of their own masters, and instead of investigating it, they let it collect dust in a sub-basement. And the way Dooku and Sifo Dyas even found it in the first place is its own warning sign. They weren't led there by a teacher. They found it because of a journal written decades earlier by a disgraced Padawan from the High Republic era who had gone looking for the exact same thing and never came back from what he found. That means the Order's instinct to bury its own dark side corruption, instead of confronting it directly, didn't start with Dooku's generation. It didn't start with Sifo Dyas. It was already an old habit, passed down quietly for generations. Like a family secret nobody wanted to be the one to say out loud. Costana didn't stop at hoarding artifacts. She pushed Sifo Dyas towards something the rest of the Council viewed with open suspicion: the cosmic force. Most Jedi worked with what's called the living force, the moment-to-moment current that flows through every living thing. The cosmic force is different. It's the branch tied to prophecy, to visions of what hasn't happened yet. And the Jedi, as an institution, had grown deeply uncomfortable with it. Too uncertain, too hard to verify, too easy to get wrong. Sifo Dyas trained in it anyway. And what he saw, according to the same canon material, was a war coming. Not a vague sense of unease, a specific, growing certainty that the galaxy was heading toward a catastrophic conflict. Years before Geonosis, years before anyone else in the Order believed it was even possible. He brought that warning to the Council the way any loyal Jedi would, and they dismissed him. Not because his logic was flawed, but because the method he'd used to arrive at it made them uncomfortable. According to the novel canon, he was effectively pushed out of the Order for pursuing it. Think about what that actually means. The Jedi had a working oracle standing in front of them, a man who had correctly foreseen the single most destructive event in the Order's modern history, and their institutional response was to treat his gift as a liability instead of the most valuable early warning system they had. If you want to understand why the Jedi walked into the Clone Wars without a plan, this is where it actually starts, not on Geonosis. In a council chamber, years earlier, when they told the one man who saw it coming to stop talking, cut off from the Order, humiliated, and convinced the war was still coming, whether the Council believed him or not, Sifo Dyas didn't stop preparing for it. He traveled to the cloning world of Kamino and commissioned an army. Not for himself, for the Republic. And he did it the only way he could, by claiming council authorization that he never actually had. Here's the part that should stop you. Nobody at the top of the Jedi Order ever double-checked that signature. The single largest military commission in galactic history, an army of literally millions of soldiers. While all of this was unraveling politically, the army itself was already growing on Kamino. And here's a detail almost nobody talks about. The clones weren't trained by the Jedi at all. In canon material, the clones were trained primarily by bounty hunters, largely because Jango Fett, the genetic template for the entire army, was mostly apathetic about overseeing their development personally, stayed almost entirely uninvolved in the process. That's not a minor staffing detail. The single most important fighting force the Jedi Order would ever command in its entire history was raised outside their supervision, shaped in its earliest, most formative years by a man who had personally fought against Jedi and hated them for it, going back to a brutal conflict on the planet Galadron, where Jango's own Mandalorian forces were slaughtered by a Jedi strike team. The Jedi handed the psychological and cultural foundation of their own army to someone with a documented grudge against them, and never thought to ask what that might mean down the line. Buried inside every single clone trooper was a biochip, and the Kaminoans, the scientists actually building these soldiers, were given a specific justification for it. They were told the chip was a contingency, specifically framed as protection against renegade Jedi. Here's what makes that so unsettling. It wasn't even a total lie. Dark Jedi, fallen Padawans, corrupted Force users gone rogue, these were a real, recurring problem the Jedi Order had never cleanly solved across its entire history, which means the infrastructure for a Jedi suppression protocol existed under a story that the Jedi themselves, if they'd ever bothered to ask, might have quietly accepted as reasonable. They built the justification for their own leash out of a problem they already knew was real, and never once turned that logic back around to ask who else might use it, and against whom. Now we get to Order 66 itself, and even here, most people only know the headline. What they don't know is how it was actually built. Order 66 wasn't a standalone command. It was buried among roughly 150 separate contingency orders, deliberately positioned so it would barely stand out from routine military protocol, filed away like paperwork in a system nobody had reason to scrutinize. But structurally, it was different from every other order on that list. The other 149 contingency orders could be authorized through multiple chains of command, different officers, and different circumstances. Order 66 could only ever be issued by one position, the Supreme Commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. One title, one authority. Palpatine had engineered a legal kill switch that only he could ever pull, and he'd hidden it in plain administrative sight. Inside a filing system the Jedi trusted completely because they'd never had a reason not to. This is where we come back to Tup. His chip glitched early on Ringo Vinda, and he killed Tiplar in front of witnesses. The Jedi Order had, in that single moment, the clearest possible piece of evidence that something had been deliberately planted inside their own army, and their response was to investigate it as an isolated malfunction, not as a warning about every other chip exactly like it, sitting inside every other clone across the galaxy. And here's a detail that recontextualizes the few clones who didn't turn on their Jedi when Order 66 finally came. Units like the Bad Batch, or isolated troopers like Cut Lorquain, who'd already walked away from the war entirely. It's tempting to read their resistance as loyalty, as some deep bond of trust with the Jedi they served alongside. But the more unsettling explanation is biological variance and simple distance from Kamino's programming pipeline. The Bad Batch had genetic mutations that made them different from standard clones. Cut had been off the grid for years. The Jedi spent a 3-year war believing the loyalty of their own soldiers was a relationship built on trust and shared sacrifice. It was never that. It was a manufacturing defect rate, and the ones who didn't fire, essentially, statistical outliers. If you step back and look at all of this together, it stops looking like a series of separate failures and starts looking like one continuous pattern, repeating across generations. A disgraced Padawan finds a dangerous secret and disappears. The Order buries the discovery instead of confronting it. Decades later, Dooku and Sifo Dyas find that same buried secret through his journal. Sifo Dyas tries to warn the Council using forbidden methods and gets pushed out for it. He disappears too, and the Order buries that as well. Watching all of this happen to his closest friend eventually falls to the dark side himself, and the Council doesn't catch that either. Every single checkpoint where this could have been stopped, examined, or even just acknowledged, the Order chose the same response. File it away. Don't look too closely. That pattern is what built Order 66. Not one moment of bad luck. A century, at least, of institutional avoidance, each layer hiding the one underneath it, until the thing they refused to look at finally had a trigger, and only one man in the galaxy holding the detonator, which brings us back to where we started, standing over Tipler's body with no memory of what he'd just done. The chip glitched early, and for one brief, terrifying window, the Jedi Order held in their hands the single clearest piece of evidence in galactic history that something had been planted inside their own army. They filed it as a malfunction and closed the case. The gap between Tup's malfunction on Ringo Vinda and the galaxy-wide execution of Order 66 was never really about timing. It was about how many warnings the Jedi Order was handed, one after another, across generations, and chose to bury instead of face. A vault of Sith knowledge kept secret instead of studied, an oracle silenced instead of trusted, a forged commission that sat for a decade without a single signature check, an army raised by outsiders with old grudges, a kill switch hiding in a filing cabinet under a justification the Jedi half believed themselves. The Jedi didn't fall to an enemy they never saw coming. They fell to one they had already found, more than once, and filed away every single time. But Sifo Dyas's disappearance doesn't end with him walking away from the Order. What actually happened to him afterward, and who found him first, reveals something even darker about how far this cover-up really went.